reality television. And this is because, and I've shared this before, and it's because there's not a lot of things. She likes her kind of stuff to watch if she's watching by herself. I like my kind of stuff to watch if I'm watching by myself. So if we're ever watching together, we find that this reality television is a genre that we enjoy to watch. And what that means is that when we put our kids down to bed, very often what we'll find on TV is something in that reality TV genre. And this has gone on for years. In years, in fact, I can go back to the kind of reality television that we most like to watch, I must admit, is that these dating shows. When these young people are dating and they're doing this, they're trying to find their person in front of millions of viewers, you know, and we're watching these shows. And we started with this with a show almost 20 years ago. There was a show called Temptation Island, right? And it was one of these things where I hear some people laughing. This was, you know, couples that were on an island being tempted by this bevy of beautiful models. And we were watching this, you know, when we were just, you know, 20-somethings. And that show didn't last very long, but come, you know, the very next year, it spawned another show, which has now gone on for almost 20 years, and that is, does anybody recognize The Bachelor? Right? Who all has ever seen or knows anything about this show? I see a hand here up in the front. Some are hesitatingly raising their hands there in the back. But this is a show where there's one guy and there's 25 women that he dates in order, and at the end of this, he's supposed to find his fiancée. So we've been watching these shows now almost 20 years, since 2002. My wife and I have been watching these shows together. And you know what, here it's only been in these past couple years, particularly this year, we've noticed as we're watching these shows, what we realize is that we're a lot closer now to the parents than we are to the bachelor and to these bachelorettes. And so this is something that I think, I don't know, are we getting a little too old? You know, it's kind of like we're sitting back and we're watching, you know, this is the next generation. But I've come to think about this. We're watching this show and we realize that now, if we are now the age of the parents, we started watching this show when we were the age of these kids. We're now the age of the parents. What it helps me to realize is there's now a whole generation of young people who has grown up watching this show. There's a whole generation of people who see this show and they think, well, that must be how normal people are, right? They have a whole generation now watching reality TV that is seeing these kinds of things. And perhaps it's making them disillusioned with their normal life. Perhaps it becomes a temptation to think, wouldn't life be better on the other side? Isn't grass, you know, could the grass be greener on that other side? Well, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about temptation. And this is the story that we have from Jesus in Jesus' gospel about how Jesus himself resisted temptation. And we see how temptation is a subject that is all throughout the Bible, from the book of Genesis, with Adam and Eve being tempted by the apple in the garden. And Jesus himself, it was fully human. Did you know that? Jesus was human just like you and me. That means that Jesus was subject to the same temptations, the same stresses and circumstances of life as we are. Fully human. In fact, the scripture says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, and yet without sin. So we look to Jesus, we look to these stories. Again, we read this Bible not as a dry history book, but to show us how we can contend with these questions here in our own lives today. So Jesus, for us, as an example, he's been through everything that we've been through. He can sympathize with us because he's faced all of the battles is what he's faced. But notice what it says in the scripture. Notice that it says that when Jesus was first tempted, he was there in the desert. He had been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And what does the scripture says? It says he was famished. Right? That means that Jesus was at a weak place in his life when the voice of the tempter came to him. Did you hear that? And this is something I think we can learn from this scripture, is this: when we're in the low place, when we're in a weak place, when we're stretched thin, this is when these temptations will come to us. And there's a saying that you get out of 12 Steps in Recovery. You ever seen this before? It says, halt. Halt. And what it means, if you break it down, it says, don't get too hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Right? These are the times when we get in that weak place. And so I think this is the first lesson that we learn from this scripture, that Jesus was famished. And so Jesus, like we do, Jesus needed to take a step back. He needed to halt. He needed to realize that he was in a weak place at that time in his life. And the same is true for us. Whenever we are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, or right here in Colorado, thirsty. You know, thirsty is a big one for here in this arid climate. We need to pay attention to these things to realize that we might not be responding as we otherwise would. And so when Jesus was in this weak place, just like we get into these weak places, that means that he was susceptible to hear a voice. He was susceptible to hear something that was going to distract him from God's plan and God's purpose. And this voice is described as the devil. Right? But I'm going to suggest that this may not be a devil that you can you can see, but maybe this devil that's described in this conversation is more something that was a voice in his ear. In fact, the scripture says the devil from the Greek is from diabolos, meaning slanderer or false accuser. And I don't know about you, but that's true in my experience. When I can get into that weak place, I can sometimes, it's not an actual voice, but I can sometimes be contending in my mind with, there's a battlefield in my mind where I know what is the right thing to do, but then there's there's something in my mind that says, well, no, maybe you can make an excuse. You know, maybe you don't have to do the right thing this time. I believe that from this conversation, we're talking about Jesus contending with the devil, and what I think we can make a point that connects it to our own experience that says, really, Jesus was having a battle in his mind. Right? A battle over whether he should do what God was calling him to do, or whether he should do what the temptation was calling him to do. And I think that this might be true for all of us. In fact, did you know that this is that our thinking is actually a conversation that we're having with ourselves in our head? This comes from ancient times, even hundreds of years before Jesus. The philosopher Plato, he defined thinking as, when the mind is thinking, he says it is talking to itself. So what we're talking about is this internal dialogue that we, all of us, have in our mind. And the question is, where does the voice come from? Right? Is this voice from God? Or is this voice from the enemy? From the accuser? And we've seen in recent times, there's been more psychologists, philosophers who have described this even more. You know, this voice is this voice. I think the Bible describes it as your adversary, as the accuser, the devil. In later times, Freud described it as the id. You know, the id. These are these destructive thoughts that we have that seek our own destruction. Later, Jung described it as the shadow. This same type of thing. This is the thing that we all as human beings deal with, right? The conflict in the battlefield of our mind. And then, of course, George Lucas took that concept of the shadow and talked about the dark side. But what I think we're talking about here is we're not contending, perhaps, with a little red guy with horns and a tail. We're contending with something that's happening up here. We're contending with conflict in our minds, in this internal dialogue. And these are all different ways to describe the accuser, the adversary, right? When we are conflicted within our own minds. And we've seen all these examples. There's other ways, I think, throughout literature to describe this adversary, this accuser. One of the ways that I think means most to me, that's something that I grew up with, that has really given me an image of what it is that's against me, comes from C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia. Who knows C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia? And so who is the adversary? Who is the accuser in the Chronicles of Narnia? It's a character called the White Witch. Do you know this? Have you seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Do you know what I'm talking about? If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is a situation where the adversary, the accuser, has cast a spell. She's a witch, and she's cast a spell over the land of Narnia, where you remember, it's always winter, but never Christmas. And so the story goes that there's 4 human children that come into that world in order to fulfill the prophecy and to break the spell. But this is a story about temptation. And how this White Witch works is she tempts one of these children to betray his brothers and sisters. And this is how she tempts them, with what is called Turkish delight. Who knows the story? Please raise your hand if you know the story of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's some that don't know this story. But, you know, when I was a little boy, I read this story when I was about the age of my daughter, who was up here this morning, Eden. And I imagined that Turkish delight is something, that must be really something. What kind of candy would cause a little boy to betray his brothers and sisters? That must have been the best candy in the world. Right? And I imagined it, in my 8-year-old mind, I imagined it as maybe being something like baklava, Turkish delight. I thought, but it must have been way better than any baklava that I'd ever had. Right? We'll come to find out that the Turkish delight is nothing at all like baklava. Right? But in fact, I was reading a story, I was reading an article and reminded of this just this past week. Apparently, I'm not the only person who has fantasized about what kind of candy would cause a little boy to betray his family. Right? But I had a fantasy about this. I imagined it as being something. And apparently, other people have imagined it as being something too. This article that I read the other day, it was titled, C.S. Lewis' Greatest Fiction was Convincing American Kids That They Would Like Turkish Delight. Right? And this is what the author says. He says, all we knew was that the Turkish delight was an exotic-sounding treat that would be your first request if a mysterious woman asked you, what would you like best to eat? And we knew that Edmund loved Turkish delight so much he put his siblings in the entire land of Narnia in harm's way in exchange for more. So we wound up imagining whatever we'd have liked best. And see, that's the point of it. That's the point of temptation. The reason I share this long story with you is because I think this gets right down to the very point that temptation, for me, is I imagine whatever I would like best. And so what does that mean? That means that what's a temptation for me may not be a temptation for you. Because the adversary, the accuser, knows our hearts and knows our particular personality types and offers up temptations that are specifically tailored to each and every one of us. That's why a lot of us in this church, we've gone through 2 years of study in our young people's group around something called the Enneagram. Do you know the Enneagram? Some of you do. Raise your hand if you know the Enneagram. Right? But what does the Enneagram tell us? It tells us we each have a different personality type, and which means that we each have certain temptations that are specific to we ourselves. For example, this is a diagram, one of the diagrams of the Enneagram. And look how different numbers are tempted by different, what the Bible would call besetting sins. 9 are tempted by sloth. 1s are tempted by anger. 2s are by pride. What is this saying? This is saying that what may be a temptation to you is not necessarily a temptation to me, and vice versa. But the accuser, the adversary, knows exactly where our buttons are, and knows exactly where the points are that we have a weakness. And the accuser, the adversary, is going to appeal to us at that very point of weakness. Yet regardless, whenever we are tempted, you may not be tempted by the same thing that I'm tempted by, but whenever we are tempted, does it not always start with a conversation that happens in our head? Does it not always start with us debating with an accuser, with an adversary, and making a decision? Even if we know what is the right thing to do, that voice of temptation says, well, maybe make an excuse. Maybe not this time. And it's all of these thoughts and worries and fears that we have in our head that are not of God. But in the moment, we don't necessarily know which voice to listen to. And you know what? Sometimes there's even old tapes that are established, old, familiar ways of thinking that are so well established that it's really hard for us to turn the volume down and listen to the true voice of God. Temptation is not only about things that are out there, but they're about things that are in here. Temptations to worry, temptations to fear, temptations to be negative. I'll give you an example. A Christian author, Joyce Meyer. Do you know the author Joyce Meyer? Right, this is what she writes. She says, "For many years, I believed I was unhappy because of things others were doing or not doing. I blamed my misery on my husband and children. Then I finally faced the truth, which was that none of these things had to make me unhappy if I chose to have the right attitude. My thoughts," she concludes, "my thoughts were what were making me miserable." And this jives right with the Scripture, where the Scripture says, as a person thinks in his heart, so is he. Again, we establish these old tapes, and they're very deeply ingrained. But that pattern of thinking, it affects our very lives. It affects our very experience of this life, just like what Joyce Meyer said. And she continues to say that the hardest part, she says, she described that the hardest part of being set free from this negative attitude, she says, is facing the truth and saying, I'm negative and I want to change. Is that not true for each and every one of us? That we first have to see ourselves, we have to see where those weaknesses are, we have to see where those temptations are, so that then we can turn those over for God, over to God. You see, for Joyce Meyer, that negativity was a temptation just like the drugs are to an addict. She kept going back to that same pattern of thinking. But just like an addiction, until she could recognize it, until she could turn it over to God, then it was that attitude, that pattern of thinking that was running the show, even when she didn't realize that for herself. So it makes all the difference what thoughts that we allow to occupy our mind. And so just like Joyce Meyer, there's a certain point where we have to say, enough is enough. And just like Jesus, there's a certain point where we have to say, away with you, Satan. Again, Satan is the name of the accuser. Satan is the name of the adversary. Satan is the name for this pattern of thinking that's keeping us from being the person that we're called to be. And so, ultimately, just like Joyce Meyer, the hardest part, we have to recognize that pattern, and we have to say, I don't want to be this person anymore. And it's not that we can change this ourselves, but if we turn this stuff over to God, then God can start working on this. And God can change us and make us into the very people that we're called to be. Do you see how once Jesus said that, once Jesus said, away with you, Satan, what happened? It said suddenly angels came and waited on him. And this is true also for us. If we can say to whatever it is, whatever might be the temptation, whether it's our thoughts, whether it's something out there, whether it's something in here, if we can say, away with you, I don't want to be that person anymore, then guess what? Just like Jesus, we will find the strength and the power, just like angels are coming to wait on us. We can find that strength that comes from beyond ourselves, that we don't have to lean on our own strength, but we can find that deeper source and that deeper well of strength and power in our lives. Because whether we are tempted by substances, like Edmund and the Turkish delight, or whether we're tempted by thinking the grass always looks greener on the other side, like I think a lot of times when we watch these reality shows, that's what it makes us feel. Or whether we're like Joyce Meyer, and the temptation is something that's inside our head, a temptation to old tapes or to negative thoughts. The point is that we first have to identify these things as temptations, and then we have to turn these over to God, and God will give us the strength to contend with whatever it might be. God is bigger than whatever the enemy might be. Do you believe that? And so if you're leaving this place today thinking, I can't believe my pastor watches The Bachelor, then I want to say I'll argue that for me, for my wife Nikki, it's not a temptation. We've done this for 20 years. However, there are things out there which are, for me, serious temptations. And those are the things that I keep at arm's length. I don't do that in my own strength, but I do that in the strength that comes from God and Jesus Christ. And this is true for each and every one of us. That it's not because of what we've done. It's because of what God has done for us. And that strength and power is available to each and every one. All we have to do is ask. Thanks be to God this day and always.